welcome everyone to our first session of week 2 of Symposium 2021. I actually hosted the first session last Monday, so it's nice symmetry that I'm doing our Monday session this week as well. So I'm Sharon Myers, I'm the CEO of HFA, and it is my pleasure to introduce this session, and it is called Let's Keep Talking to Each Other with Dr. Adar Cohen. And so if you're not familiar with Adar, he is an internationally renowned mediator who's led high-stakes conversations in conflict zones, family rooms, and other places where people can save the world. I love that saying. Kind of like our corner of the world. So he has united gang leaders and police officers to prevent homicides in Chicago. And following the Good Friday peace agreement in Northern Ireland, Adar helped Catholics and Protestants plan for a shared future in Belfast. Adar's work has been featured in the New York Times, TED Talks, MSNBC, and other areas. He holds a PhD in conflict resolution from the University of Dublin and has lectured at Harvard University and at the University of Chicago. He is a co-founder of the Civic Leadership Foundation, and he's a published author. I mean, there is nothing this guy can't do. He is amazing. And tonight's session will last roughly an hour from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And we are so honored to have Adar as our first speaker of the evening. And you're going to love him. Adar is absolutely amazing, and we love working with him. And this session is just so timely because in order for us to grow as a community, we have to keep talking to each other. And as a reminder, all attendees will be on mute throughout the session, and there will be time for a Q&A as we end this session. So feel free to enter your questions into the chat box, and we'll be collecting those throughout. So I'll be collecting those. And if you have technical difficulties or need to speak to an HFA staff member, please put your concerns in the chat box, or you can use the Slack environment, which is #helpdesk channel for your concerns. But before we begin the session, I would like to take a minute to thank our sponsors. So let me go one more slide. So thank you so much to our symposium sponsors. Their support of HFA has been a partnership that we truly, truly value. And they have just been so patient with us and understanding as we've moved virtual 2 years in a row now. So we are just so appreciative. And don't forget to go to the HFA exhibit hall throughout symposium so you can visit the virtual booths that they've set up, and they put a lot of work into it. So please take a look at it. And I think you're going to like how easy it is to navigate. And Adar, I'm going to stop sharing my screen in just a second, and the floor will be yours, so you can actually come back on camera. There you go. And I'm here to help if you need anything, and I'll actually jump back on at 5:45 for Q&A. So let me stop sharing my screen, and I will turn it over to you. And thank you so much for being here. We're so excited.
Sharon, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to all of you, the entire HFA community. It's been meaningful to me to get connected with you all, and I'm honored to be here. I'll start by telling you that at breakfast this morning, I told my daughter that I would be home a little bit late this evening, still in time for bedtime, but I'd be at my office a little later than usual because I was going to be with you wonderful people. And as usual, she asked me, do you need any advice? She's in first grade. And I was thinking about the fact that here we are, still meeting, still gathering, still convening together, but apart because we're connected online. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to see all of you. And hoping that we would still find a way to connect with one another. And so I asked her, did she have any advice around that? And immediately she told me, just tell them your true feelings. Tell them how you really feel. Everyone just wants to hear how people really, truly feel. Pretty good advice. Pretty wonderful that it comes to over breakfast. And I'm going to take it. So here goes. Here's how I really, truly feel. I believe in a deep way that conversations create our future. That whether we talk and how we talk says everything about who we are as individuals, as people, and also as organizations, as boards of directors, as governments, as people experiencing bleeding disorders, as people supporting those who do experience them, as people who advocate for people experiencing bleeding disorders, as people who are building resources for them, who are doing research for them. But in addition to saying who we are, I think that how we talk to each other also says a lot about who we are becoming. Because it's in conversations, it's in dialogue, deliberation, and decision-making that we change. That's how we change as individuals, it's how we change as groups, it's how we change as communities. So how we approach difficult conversations becomes especially important. And I'm guided by the words of the great Maya Angelou, who I was so fortunate to have met and spent time with, and who said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for believing, or at least being curious about the power of big conversations and challenging conversations. I'm going to talk to you this evening about my work in helping people to have difficult conversations and some of the thinking that I've done to help those conversations be less difficult. How can we have them in ways that unlock connection and belonging? And through connection and through belonging, how can we unlock new possibility for ourselves and for others? So rather than go on points 1 through 25 about how all of this comes about, I'll do a little bit of that a little later. You will come away with 4 strategies you can use in your difficult conversations. But first, here's a concrete example of how connection and belonging can lead to new possibility. So I worked for many years in the city of Chicago, which experienced and continues to experience very high rates of gun violence, and where homicides are much higher than, for example, in other large cities like New York and Los Angeles. And the University of Chicago developed a crime lab that used data and really cutting edge science to try and understand how we might interrupt cycles of violence in the city. And they actually determined that even though there are so many shootings and so many people involved in shootings every year, that really there's a pretty small number of individuals around whom and through whom most of the shootings happen. So these individuals are almost, they're hubs for a lot of the violence that takes place. And of course, those individuals, to a large extent, had really difficult childhoods and not a lot of options as they were growing up, experiencing great poverty and adversity, feeling disconnected from school, from work. But the city of Chicago managed to convene a group of about 20 of these young men. And their hypothesis was, if we can work with these young guys and give them a new way of thinking about themselves, a new sense of their future, we might be able to curb gun violence before the cycle of retribution sets in motion. And what would it take to do that? So they put me in a room with some of these young men who were representing different gang affiliations, and who showed up on the first day with their hats drawn low or their hoods high or arms crossed, some way of signaling to others, and particularly to me, I'm not available. I'm not open for business. There were some walls up, some barriers up. But they came together, much like we're coming together today, asking, just by way of arriving, what could become possible for us if we were together, if we were curious, and if we were listening. They kept coming, they kept it up, they kept showing up, and they kept listening. They kept sharing with one another, and they kept on asking questions until just a few weeks into the program, Remember, the goal here is violence prevention, but violence prevention, the strategy for achieving that was to get people to connect, to talk, and eventually to try and get jobs so they could become more connected to the economy and to opportunity, and to leave behind some of the choices that they made that put them and their community in harm's way. And one day, all of a sudden, a young man comes into the room, and he starts walking around the circle where everyone's sitting in their chairs, and he's holding up a piece of paper in front of everyone's eyes. He gets quite close to people's faces with this check. And it's a check, and he's making sure everyone sees that it's his name that's written on the check. And he's incredibly proud to see his name typed on a check that's been written to him. Now, it's important to note, the check was for a sum that was for less money than he was used to earning in his shadow economy. But he was incredibly proud to have been recognized. To appear on a check felt like a validation to him. And he kept showing it to everyone seated around the circle. All of these young men were fascinated by this. And at first they teased him a little bit, but then they asked, well, how did you do that? Where did you go? Where did you get the job? And he started to explain, well, I borrowed my aunt's car and I drove to Schaumburg, which is a suburb outside of Chicago. And I got a job at this place. You'd never believe it. It's called the Cheesecake Factory, but they make more than cheesecakes there. And everyone's starting to get curious. What is it? What do they make? It's a factory? You got a job in a factory? No, it's a restaurant. I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Now I'm moving up to dishwasher. They become really curious. And one of them asks, do you think you could take me? Do you think you could introduce me? Maybe I could get a job there too. And he took his friend, and his friend got a job. And now they're both driving back and forth to Schaumburg in his aunt's car to work shifts at the Cheesecake Factory. And then one by one, they keep earning the trust of the manager there, who sees some very hard workers. And now 5, 6, 7, 8 of them have jobs at this same Cheesecake Factory in Schaumburg, Illinois. And finally, the original guy's aunt says, hey, listen, I need my car back. It's wonderful that you all have gotten jobs and are looking after your future and getting out of the violence and out of what puts you and others in harm's way. But I do need my car. So what these guys did together is that they pooled their resources. They put what little money they had together, and they bought a minivan that they owned together. And then still more of these young men got jobs at the Cheesecake Factory. And now this van is rumbling through Chicago, back and forth between Chicago and Schaumburg for shifts upon shifts upon shifts at the Cheesecake Factory. Remember, these young men were from rival gangs when they started this discussion project. When they first showed up to see what would it be like to listen to each other, to share, and to find connection. They found connection. They actually found belonging. And in that, they found great new possibility for themselves. What happens when we find new ways to connect, or old ways to connect, but we connect with each other? Think about it. Where you work, in your home, in your neighborhood, what becomes possible when we feel unmistakably and completely that we belong? What becomes possible for us then, for all of us, when we can feel that? A man falls ill, and he's a dad and a husband and a grandfather and a great-grandfather. And everyone in his family, they don't just admire him, they love him. Everyone in his family wants the best for him. So when he falls ill, his whole family springs into action. But as soon as they do, as soon as they start organizing his care, his surgeries, his medications, the decisions, where he's going to live, this is during the time of COVID. So it's difficult. They completely implode as a decision-making team. His 2 daughters, they've had their share of misunderstandings over the years. Now they're no longer speaking, and their spouses get involved, and arguments about his care lead to arguments about his estate. Nieces and nephews and grandkids all get involved. It's a full-blown family crisis. Meanwhile, this beloved man, all he wishes for is peace in his family. And his family is willing to give him everything to keep him comfortable, the best medical care, to call in favors, to move mountains. But peace, they cannot give him. Why not? Because he doesn't want the top doctor in the country for his condition. He just wants his family to stop fighting. And they can't give that to them. Why is that? These are the kinds of questions that keep me up at night, quite literally, because I am a mediator, which means I help people have really difficult conversations like this one so they can get through some of the toughest moments in their lives. And I do this for families and for healthcare institutions and for big companies and small companies and campaigns. And my daughter gives me advice, like the advice I shared from our breakfast chat this morning for all of the work that I do. So I'd like to ask you all briefly to pick up a pen or a pencil and to write down a single word, just one. And the word I want you to write down is the word that best describes how you feel when you think about having a conversation you've been avoiding. An important one, the one that you think about most days. What's the one word that best captures how you feel about having that difficult conversation? Chances are the first one you thought of, yeah, that's the one. So take a moment and write down the word that best captures how you feel about having that difficult conversation. Now, I'm willing to bet that for some of you, the word nervous or anxious was written down, or some iteration of angry or sad or frustrated or confused. We can check later during the Q&A. I'd like to know what you wrote down. But whatever you wrote down is probably all the proof we need that these conversations are hard and that we have very good reasons for avoiding them, for putting them off, or for just having the conversations around the edges, not really diving into them. So we have good reasons for avoiding conflict, but when we avoid conflict and when we chronically avoid these important conversations, my belief is that that is actually creating new conflict, and it's creating a more complex kind of conflict, which we then have to avoid as well. And we have to work around it, and we have to waste big amounts of time and energy. And our relationships are affected over time. They're actually changed by that avoidance. So yes, these conversations are really heavy, but that's not necessarily a good enough reason not to have them. Because after all, if they are so heavy, why should we carry them around with us for weeks and months and even years? So for the family whose grandfather was suffering through great illness, but worse for him, suffering the pain of seeing his family fight, I worked with that family. And I brought them through a carefully designed, highly structured series of conversations. Some of these were one-on-one conversations. Some of them were 8-person Zooms. Some of them were text threads, and also AirPod walks. Any way that we could connect to help them to start talking in ways that were less destructive, less exhausting, less hostile, so that they could hear each other. And they had conversations that enabled them to better understand one another and to feel understood. And the results of that were that they got more clarity. They set some shared agreements, and some even reestablished a sense of connection that they didn't think would be possible, which means they were able to grant their beloved grandfather and great-grandfather his biggest wish. So how did they do that? That's what I want to talk to you about today. It wasn't through miracles. It wasn't through some secret sauce. There was no magic involved. Really, if I distill everything that I did with them down to the most basic elements, there were 4 strategies we used to help this family move forward. And I'm going to share those 4 strategies with you now. There will be time when we, toward the end of our session, for you to ask questions. So if you have them, jot them down, stay with them. I'd love to try and answer them. But here are the 4 strategies. Number 1, set the conversation apart. What does that mean? Well, basically what it means is schedule your big conversations in advance. Agree mutually with the person or persons you need to talk to. Agree mutually with them on a time and a space. You can think of using the scheduling process as a confidence building challenge, because agreeing to a time creates a precedent for the group being able to figure out something together, even if it's just the day and time and online platform that's going to be used. By agreeing in advance, all the people involved, even if it's just you and your counterpart, you both have a mental picture of what to expect, which decreases anxiety, which increases how constructively people can show up. But most importantly, scheduling the conversation ensures that the group or the two individuals, that you can at least start from a calmer, steadier place, rather than hashing something out in the heat of the moment, because that, as we all know, rarely ends well. So I say, don't try to thread a needle in the midst of a hurricane. When we're hot and when we're moving quick, when our frustration spills over and we decide, that's it, we're finally going to talk this out, that's not the optimal time to talk something out. So set a time and then reschedule that time if it becomes inopportune. You want to increase the likelihood of the conversation going well. And the last point here about setting the conversation apart is to close the conversation or pause it before people's batteries are empty. These conversations are profoundly exhausting. Even the lead up to it, knowing that it's coming, has a kind of exhausting effect on us. So we don't have to do the whole thing in one go. Take a break and come back to it when people are fresh. If you try to go for too long, you can start to undo the progress that you made earlier in the conversation, and you don't want to do that. It's totally acceptable to say, you know what, we've heard each other out. I think we're getting somewhere, we're not done, but let's come back to this when we're both fresh. So that's number one, set the conversation apart. Strategy number two. This one sounds really obvious. It's not totally obvious. Ask questions. So when we ask a question in a conversation, we are, in a very real way, we're offering our counterpart in that conversation an important opportunity, and it's the opportunity to be understood, and importantly, to feel understood. And when people feel more understood, they immediately become more capable of listening well, even through adversity and across difference. They become more capable of listening well and of understanding. The trick is that someone needs to get that cycle started. Someone needs to be the one to interrupt the cycle of not listening and be the first to listen well. But in a high conflict situation, no one is really in the mood to go first. So this is the trick. If you can prepare a series of open-ended questions before your challenging conversation, write them down. You'll create space for your counterpart to feel heard, which enables them to do a better job of hearing you. Wherever I've worked as a mediator, if you'll trust me on this, I keep finding that it works this way. So you need to develop some open-ended questions. We all know what an open-ended question is. It's one that's hard to respond to in a yes or no or in a single word. But a really good open-ended question feels like a really big moment to its recipient. Just being asked this kind of question can feel like a kind of breakthrough to them, even before they start to answer it. And the reason for that is that it's almost impossible to stay clenched and to stick to a script when someone asks you an open-ended question about your experience. Generally speaking, we can't resist those kinds of questions. They're disarming. Curiosity has a really powerful effect on us as human beings. So come to your difficult conversation ready with a bunch of really good open-ended questions. Write them down, edit them in advance, and bring them with you. Those questions are not just a gift to your counterpart. A lot of people tell me, that's so generous. This person has really been up to some mischief. Are you sure, Adar, that they deserve me asking them all these generous, open-ended questions? If you're not feeling particularly generous toward them, think of it this way. Asking them these open-ended questions is also a gift to you. It's a way you can be generous to yourself, because having them at hand before the conversation makes the conversation easier for you. It's calming, it's steadying, it's something you can rely on and come back to. And it's powerfully effective in helping you to get out of the conflict cycle, because your counterpart feeling heard, remember, allows them to suddenly understand you in a deeper way and listen to you in a better way. So rule number one, remember, is set the conversation apart, schedule it, agree in advance. Number two is to ask questions and be ready to ask questions you've developed in advance. And so if you're asking really good open-ended questions, you're going to need to be ready for strategy number three, which is to listen. As a mediator, I know that if I can get people to listen to each other in a deeper way than they've been listening to each other, and for a little longer than the listener might prefer, good things start to happen. Now, if there are any mediators or arbitrators or other conflict resolution professionals who might be seeing this and listening to this right now, I'm sorry for what I'm about to do, but I have to tell the truth to the good people of the HFA community. So I'm going to give up the big secret of conflict resolution. And that is that some conflicts don't have a perfect win-win solution. There it is. The cat's out of the bag. I think that's a myth. A concrete solution to a complex conflict is really difficult to find. It's even harder to implement, and it's really, really hard to sustain. I'm thinking, for example, of recently divorced parents who have a history of poor communication, new partners, stressful lives, packed schedules, and kids with evolving, changing needs. Is there a perfect solution to the divorcing parents' conflict? Probably not. But here lies the secret of successful mediation, is that good listening is better than the best problem solving. Because listening well to our counterpart, even if we disagree, especially if we disagree, is the best route to resolution, because their feeling heard makes them better listeners, as we've established, which means we'll feel heard soon afterward. And then that becomes the cycle. Feeling heard rather than not asking, not listening, and not feeling heard. In difficult conversations, especially in families, listening without interrupting and refuting what's being said is essential. It's essential at work. It's essential in difficult community conversations. I can guarantee you, you probably already know this, you will want to litigate. You will want to make your points. When you're sticking to strategy number three, just listen. Here's why. Your listening is doing more for you at this stage in the conversation than even the best litigating can do for you. Listening is doing more for you than anything else, including doing one very positive thing against conflict, which is to slow things down, because conflict loves speed. So slowing down is a good thing. And listening deeply slows conversations down. So recapping, rule number one, set the conversation apart. Rule number two, ask questions, prepare them in advance. And rule number three is listening, deep listening. And if we've done those things and we're listening well, we can hope to encounter silence, which is strategy number three, to embrace silence, or at least not to flee from it in a panic. In heated or volatile conflict, slowing down is a good thing. And one indication you've succeeded in slowing down your conversation is that it slows down to the point of an occasional silence. So try not to panic. Silence can be okay. In challenging conversations, silence can be more valuable than the most thoughtful and well-chosen words. Oftentimes when I'm working with a family or a workplace, the breakthrough moments in a tough conversation are preceded by a brief silence. But generally speaking, we're terrified of even the briefest pause, especially in a tense conversation. We feel awkward, feel profoundly awkward and nervous about that silence. So we blurt something out that maybe isn't even what we really wanted to say in that moment and might actually set the conversation back. But it's worth asking, what is actually happening during a brief pause or even an extended period of silence? So to go back to our earlier example, the two sisters who were disagreeing bitterly over how to care for their ailing father. One of the daughters, a really extreme example of our aversion to silence, she interpreted I was on the call with them, a 2-second pause as evidence of her sister's recalcitrance and stubbornness. But actually, the sister who had paused had really barely begun to process what had been said and would have needed several more seconds to respond productively. Silence gives people the moment they need to absorb what they just heard. People need to orient themselves, to gather themselves. And all of that enables them to ask a question or offer a thought that is significantly more useful than their instantaneous reaction. They might even be getting ready to say, you know what? Now that I'm hearing it this way, maybe you're right. Maybe I could have done something differently, right? Those statements as a mediator, when I hear them, they're preceded by silence. But if we rush in and squander that silence and blurt something out, treat silence as a liability rather than as an asset, we're shortchanging our capability, our potential in difficult conversations. So it might be as simple as just allowing a little bit more silence than you're accustomed to or than you're typically comfortable with allowing. So those are the 4 strategies for having difficult conversations and trying to have them well. And whether I'm working with universities or hospitals or political campaigns or families, I'm using these 4 strategies. First, agree mutually on where and how you're going to have the conversation. Set it apart. Number 2, use open-ended questions to power. Number 3, transformative listening, deeper listening. And once you get there, strategy 4, try not to squander the silence. Try not to chase off those breakthrough moments by blurting something out because of discomfort or awkwardness. What becomes possible when we use these strategies, and no one's perfect, we can't use all 4 of them flawlessly. It's to try them. It's to try to keep as many of them on the table at once as possible and to do our best with them. The family clashing as they cared for their beloved father and grandfather and great-grandfather. They were finally able to hear his wish and fulfill his wish that they stopped fighting. And they were able to do that by asking each other good open-ended questions and then staying with the listening, even if they didn't agree. Even if they were not getting persuaded, they listened anyway because they knew that that was going to have a positive effect on the whole process. And what became possible for them is that they were able to divide responsibilities, to set boundaries, and that decreased the intensity and frequency of miscommunications and confrontations. Now everyone's talking again. Everyone's on speaking terms, and it isn't all easy. It's not as though all the problems went away. There are still disagreements, but they all agreed as part of their process to keep Grandpa out of it, to divide and conquer on medical coordination, and to stay in their lanes. And it won't surprise you, but it's worth reminding ourselves that all along, as they clashed, and as they said unfortunate things about one another, their kids were watching it all. They were watching the fighting, the talking about one another, and now they're watching the collaboration. The kids were seeing the adults in their family criticize one another and undermine one another, and now they're watching them find a way to figure it out together. And so when I think about the kids in that family, naturally I also think about my kids. And now we're back to my first grader who advised me this morning to tell you all how I really feel. And so here it is. This is how I feel. I feel very strongly that conversations are how we can build a future that's worthy of our kids and our grandkids and those coming after them. And that whether or not we have these conversations, tough as they may be, and how we have them is totally and completely up to us. What else has this much impact on our lives? So how we approach these moments actually decides our futures. As Maya Angelou said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So if I can ask you now, please look down, and I'd like to know, Michelle, is it possible for us to re-enable the chat at this stage? Michelle, Sharon, if you can do that, that would be great. And if not, there's a workaround for that. Chat is on. Thank you. Amazing. What a quick turnaround. They're so on it. So here's what I'd like you to do in just a second. First, I'd like you to take another look at that word you wrote down earlier. I asked you to write down a single word that best captures how you feel about having that difficult conversation you might be avoiding. What I'd like you to do now is write down a second word. And the second word I'd like you to write down is same prompt, but how are you feeling about it now? If you think about these four tools you could use, is there a different word that comes to mind for you that captures how you feel about maybe trying to have this conversation? So now I'd like you to choose that second word. And now, if you're on the chat, if it's available to you, give us both words, the first and then the second. What's the first word you wrote down? And now what's the second word you're writing down right now? And let's see them come up. Okay. We have them coming in. My goodness. Okay, I'm going to try to read some of these. So we went from intimidated to secure, scared to butterflies. I love this. Frustrated to hurt, nervous to trusting, reluctant to encouraged, useless to hopeful, anxious to calmer, anxiety to cucumbers. I love it. I need to know more. Nauseous to gracious, able to take the high road, scared to still nervous a little. This is incredible. Take a look. I don't have time to read all of them, but I hope to afterward, and you certainly can continue to look and write it in if you haven't written yours yet. Thank you all for sharing. This is really powerful to see. This is fantastic. Thank you all. Little goat, don't worry. There will be cucumbers in the spring. Somebody remembers Bozakna mir bahar miad, kombi zevachiyar miad. This is somebody who must have been in an earlier session with me and knows that I like to share Persian proverbs. And in Farsi, in Persian, there's a beautiful saying that my grandmother likes to tell me when I need encouragement. She says, Bozakna mir bahar miad, kombi zevachiyar miad. Dear goat, yes, dear goat, it rhymes in Persian. Dear goat, don't despair. The springtime will arrive and there will be cucumbers. So thanks for remembering that. Here's what I'd like to do next. I want to just reiterate and ask again, what becomes possible when we find new ways or use old ways to connect? And when by connecting, we start to feel that we belong. What new possibilities become available to us? Whether we imagine what it was like to ride in that van with a very unlikely group of passengers who were creating new opportunity for themselves through the connection and sense of belonging that they had built for one another. Those young men went out into their communities, not just as workers in a 21st century workplace, but also as ambassadors for living more peaceful lives. They went and found the younger kids who looked to them as role models and said, you need to think about staying in school, and you need to think about what kind of employment you want to secure for yourself and what kind of future you'd like to have. What becomes possible when we find ways to connect and when we make it possible for us and others to feel we belong? So my daughter told me this morning to tell you how I really feel, and I feel I've taken her advice. I've told you how I really feel. And I am so appreciative to Sharon and to the entire HFA community for having me. As I really like to do, I've allowed plenty of time for questions. So now would be a good time, I think, to transition to that, if it's possible to do that. And I think questions can come via chat. Hey, Sharon, so good to see you.
Hi.
Questions can come via chat, and how do you want them to come, Sharon?
Yeah, if you haven't put a question in, go ahead and put it in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'm going to actually switch back to my screen and share my slides really quick. So give me just a second. Oh, they're already coming in. And if you want to start answering, let me just switch back to my slide really quick.
Okay. Yeah, the first question is, oh, I just lost it. Hang on. How do we get to have that conversation and avoid conflict, yet find a way to get to a resolution? Let me see. How do we get to have that conversation and avoid conflict, yet find a way to get to a resolution? I think I'm not sure I completely understand it really well. So I'll take a second version of the question if you have it. But I think essentially that stopping avoiding a difficult conversation is its own solution power. And that even if in our attempt to have a difficult conversation, it remains difficult, and even if we don't completely resolve it, our attempt is building up a reserve for productive movement. It's actually building momentum toward a sustainable solution, even if we don't reach it right away. Stopping the avoidance is like taking a couple of bowling balls out of our backpack, which can only be a good thing, because the weight of avoiding conflict is a significant one, and we're carrying that. If I haven't answered the question well enough, please ask me again.
And there's some more. They're kind of coming in rapid fire right now. So I'll go ahead and help you out here. So what is a good strategy to breathe or wait patiently through the silence? Because that is a tough one, waiting through the silence.
The silence, right. So for me, I experienced the same kind of twinge of awkwardness and the panic that comes with silence. My strategy, generally speaking, is to give myself a task. So one thing I can do is to start to think, could I come up with an even better open-ended question for my counterpart right now? And just that task gives me something to engage so that I'm not experiencing the full pain and discomfort of the silence. And here's the other thing, is some perspective about the silence. It can feel like an oppressive, heavy, debilitating silence. And remember, it generally feels worse for us than it does for somebody who is in their thought process, maybe reorienting themselves, maybe thinking what they want to say next, where do they want to go, maybe making sense of what just was said. So we can remind ourselves, it isn't as bad as it seems. It isn't as bad as it seems. In fact, if Adar wasn't just totally full of nonsense, maybe something really good is happening in this silence right now. Let me just wait and see. Maybe something really powerful, maybe an opening is about to come about. So reminding yourself, giving you that perspective, giving yourself a task, taking a breath, whatever works for you. I think whatever works for you to stay calm and steadied. I work with a psychologist who really believes strongly in just like simple timed breathing. So if you want to take like a 3-second inhale and a 4-second exhale, that's 7 seconds. That's like way beyond what most people are used to experiencing in the way of silence. And then finally, around silence, you can also call it out. You can also call out the silence. You can demystify it, and you can destigmatize it, and you can actually take off the worst edge of the awkwardness by saying, I just want to say that it's silent right now. And I think that can be okay. And I just want to say that for me, the silence is not lack of interest in trying or coming from a place of judgment. I just think we deserve the silence because something good might come of it. People might be really refreshed to hear that. It's like, oh, I am being given this opportunity to think deeply. You can increase trust that way. So naming it is nice too, if you feel inclined.
Great. The next question is, what do you suggest for conversations that do not result in something positive? Because you said not everyone is a win-win situation.
And so could you read it one more time, Sharon, from the beginning?
Mm-hmm. Yes. What do you suggest for conversations that do not result in something positive?
Yeah, right. And so this is like many of our first attempts, right? Let's normalize that it might not be a home run on the first swing. So I think it can be really helpful to pause one of those conversations where nothing resoundingly positive emerged during that conversation and say, I don't think we've come upon any grand resolution here. I don't feel particularly resolved about anything, and I don't imagine you do either. But I do think it's worth our pointing out that we tried, and I personally would be open to trying again, because I don't think these moments, they don't get resolved. It would be unusual and perhaps unreasonable to expect us to completely resolve this in one attempt. But I personally will commit to talking again if you would like to. So you can name the fact that this can be a journey, and then this doesn't all resolve in one single magical attempt. That acknowledgement is a way of building confidence in the process and a way of respecting the effort that each of you put in.
Great. I'm going to paraphrase this one. Well, actually, I'm just going to read it. So how do you handle going to a specialist that you've waited months to see, and you have all your questions prepared, and it seems like the visit just takes like 10 minutes and you leave without what you came for? And I think what I was thinking before is like, you put all this effort and time into it, like what this person is saying, and you're just not getting back what you had hoped.
Yeah, that's tough, because we're feeling disappointed in a moment where we really needed something. We either needed more clarity, we needed more information, we needed more resolution. I think what can happen, one thing that happens in those moments is that we start to panic, or we start to think so quickly that it's hard to recover, because we're dealing with disappointment and confusion and maybe frustration. So I think in those moments, it's really important to name what we're experiencing. And we don't always do this because it sort of feels like it's countercultural. We're not supposed to say, "Oh, this is frustrating and confusing. I thought that I was going to be able to talk about this more, or I thought, there would be more time for this." But I think naming it in the moment, naming what we're experiencing gives our counterpart, in this case, the healthcare provider, right, gives them the best shot that they can have to address the need. Whereas if we go inward with the frustration or disappointment or confusion, we're now drastically decreasing our chances of having our needs met, because we leave it to the person to guess what's disappointing us. So I think naming it is the best we can do in those moments.
Great. You'll like this one. Regarding scheduling a tough conversation, if you say we need to talk, someone's probably going to make a run for it.
Right.
So how would you tee this up to schedule a tough conversation? So people just won't just say, "Oh, tell me now." You want to take time to do it later. So how do you tee that up?
Yeah, I think the way to tee that up is to reveal your intentions, to say, "Look," and now I'm speaking so generally, you have to apply your own specificity to this. But if you say to the person, "Look, things are tough," you can name what's tough. This isn't going the way I think either of us would hope. What I'd really like to do is set aside some time where I could really do some listening. I'd really like to understand your concerns, your hopes, your feelings. I'd really like to understand where you're coming from. Could we set time aside for me to listen to you talk about what you're hoping for or what you're concerned about? Generally speaking, right, that when you come with curiosity, people are going to find that more disarming, and they'll probably be more open to it than if we had said, hey, what I'd like to do is I have a lot that I'm going to lay into you, and I've got a lot to tell you. Can we put a time on the calendar where I'm going to really set you straight? Right? People are for sure not going to do. But if we tell them, and really, if you're even halfway serious about my approach, you're going to show up with questions and ready to listen more than you feel like you'd like to. Let them know, right? It can be an enticement. The engagement can start before you even meet, and then follow through. And what happens is, remember, once people experience that level of listening, something magically comes over them and they become more capable of listening well. And if they're not the kind of person who volunteers halfway through your conversation and says, hey, you've been listening to me a lot. Thank you. It feels really good to feel more understood. Can I ask you some questions? Like, will you please share with me what you're thinking about, what you're hoping for, what you're concerned about? If they don't do that naturally, because not everyone does, there's a backup option here, which is to say, thank you for sharing all that you've shared about what concerns you, about what you're hoping for, about what you'd prefer. I feel like I understand where you're coming from more than when we started this conversation. So thank you for sharing it with me. Would it be meaningful to you if I also shared some of what concerns me, some of what I'm hoping for? And you kind of give the person the nudge that they need to say, yeah, that right. I should do that now. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, would you please? And you cue them, right? And it's a very, very, very low percentage of people who miss the opportunity to ask and reciprocate the asking themselves. And it's an even lower percentage of people who, when offered, would you like to, I just listened to you, would you like to listen to me as well? Very, very low percentage of people who would say, nah, I'm good. Right? But so we just are, we're working in probabilities here, right? So some people need the nudge.
So going back to the question that you answered, or the question you posed in the chat, how do you feel in the beginning and how do you feel now that you have some tools? If conflict makes us so anxious, why do we put it off and carry it around with us?
Yeah, because of does the question end there, Sharon? Yeah, because we are, I think, because we are afraid of what will happen when we face it. We don't want to make things worse. We don't want to lose control. We don't want to have career limiting outcomes. We don't want to increase tension or strife in our families. We rightly anticipate that facing the conflict is going to send out ripple effects. And so we're cautious, and we ought to be. But my feeling is we don't have to make a choice between avoiding it and letting kind of chronic conflict avoidance become the norm in our relationships. We don't have to make a choice between avoiding and having full blast, knock down, drag out fights. We don't have to make a choice between those two. We can actually make a choice to have conversations that are fairly safe, with a fairly decent chance of getting ourselves heard by hearing others first, and maybe even increasing understanding to the point that wonderful solutions are reached. That's a viable option. Our chronic avoidance is built on the assumption that that's not possible, that's not available. And I think that's a myth.
Well, that was the last question that we have. So sorry about that. I know we could go on for a long time, but you have done an absolutely amazing job, and it is wonderful to see you again. And I have just a quick announcement. Let me get some of these things off of my desktop here. Okay, so one final thing is to complete the session evaluation, and it will launch automatically when the session ends. It'll actually be in your internet browser, not in your Zoom window. So make sure you don't have any pop-ups blocked or anything like that. And don't forget to add your name to the evaluation to be eligible for the daily prize drawing. And remember to return to the agenda on hfasymposium.org to find links to other sessions happening tonight and over the next few days. And again, Adar, thank you so much for your session today. It was wonderful. We could have went on with questions a long time because they were coming in all over the place. But again, thank you so much for being here and being with this community, and we appreciate you so much. And always a pleasure seeing you. And everyone, thank you so much for being on this session today. There's many more to see tonight, so please join us. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, everyone. Good night.